I've worked the graveyard shift for almost 18 years, and I can tell you, the dead don't scare me. It's the things that don't stay quiet that make your skin crawl. So that shift started like any other. The air was cold, not from the weather, but from the weight that settles over you when you're surrounded by rows of stones, marking where life ends. I was at the edge of the old section of the cemetery, where graves go back more than a century. That night, I was supposed to prepare a plot for a burial the next morning. It was like a routine. To get the dimensions right, avoid any old roots, and don't hit anything unexpected. As I pushed the shovel into the ground, I remember thinking how quiet everything felt. No wind, no crickets. Just me and the soft crunch of dirt. I was about 4 feet deep when I hit something solid. It wasn't a rock. I felt plenty of those. This had a strange give to it, like old wood swollen with water. That wasn't good. It meant I might have been digging over an unmarked grave. I paused, wiped the sweat from my forehead, even though the air was freezing, and leaned down to look. The soil was darker around that spot, almost muddy. I tapped the object again with the tip of the shovel and felt it shift slightly, almost like it breathed. I just froze. I tried to convince myself it was just the ground settling. The earth does that sometimes, but something about the way it moved didn't feel right. Still, I kept digging. It was late, and I wanted to be done. I widened the hole, trying to avoid the object, but the more I worked, the more I noticed how damp the soil was. Too damp. It hadn't rained in days, and there was a smell. Wet earth mixed with something metallic. It clung to the inside of my nose. Then I heard it. A low, soft, scraping sound, like something sliding against wood. At first, I thought it was my tools shifting nearby, but the sound was coming from the hole. I stepped back, my boots slipping slightly on the loose dirt. The noise continued, steady and slow, like something dragging its nails across the inside of a wooden box. I stood there staring into the hole, half expecting to see movement. Nothing came, but the sound didn't stop. I wanted to walk away. I should have walked away, but I couldn't. Something kept me rooted there. Curiosity, fear, maybe both. I bent down and listened. The scraping paused, as if whatever was making the noise knew I was there. The silence pressed against my ears, thick and heavy. Then there was a thud. Not loud, just a dull knock like a soft punch from below. I stumbled back, nearly falling into the hole. The ground around it felt different, softer, looser, like it had been disturbed from underneath. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe old coffins collapse or air pockets shift. But I knew in my gut this wasn't that. The cemetery was still silent. Not even owls. No night breeze. Just a sound I'll never forget. A groan, muffled and deep, rising from the earth. Not human exactly, but close. I could feel it in my chest, more than I could hear it. I backed away slowly, eyes fixed on the hole. I didn't want to turn my back on it. I grabbed my tools and left them by the path, too afraid to carry them back toward the open grave. I sat in the truck for over an hour, engine off, staring through the windshield at that plot. Nothing else happened. The sound stopped eventually, but the feeling didn't. That heaviness stayed in my chest. I didn't sleep when I got home. I just stared at the ceiling, trying to tell myself I was tired, maybe even half asleep out there, imagining things. The next morning I came back with another worker. I didn't say anything about what I'd heard. just pointed out the plot and let him take over. I stayed back, pretending I had paperwork to finish. He didn't hear anything, didn't notice anything strange. Finished the dig without a word. They buried the new body there that afternoon, right on top of whatever was already down there. I sometimes wonder what we sealed in, or if we buried something that never wanted to stay down in the first place. Weeks passed, I kept working. The job doesn't leave much room for fear, but I've never gone near that plot again. Something about it feels unfinished, like a door that was opened and never fully closed. The dirt over it always seems just a little looser than it should be, like something underneath it is waiting for the right moment to rise. I've seen a lot on the night shift. Shadowy figures between headstones, whispers on the wind. But that sound, that slow, deliberate scraping from deep in the earth is the one that haunts me. Not because it was loud or terrifying, but because it was calm, controlled, like whatever made it knew I was there, and knew it had time. If you felt something watching you during the story, you're not alone. Strange things tend to happen after people hear these tales. So before your lights flicker or your screen goes dark, like, comment and share it, so you're not the only one haunted. And whatever you do, subscribe before midnight, because they always notice the quiet ones. I've been digging graves for almost 2 decades, and for the most part, the job is exactly what you'd expect. Quiet, heavy work surrounded by silence and soil. You get used to the cold morning air, the sound of your own breath, and the strange comfort that comes from routine. But there are nights that stain your memory. Nights that remind you just how thin the line is between the living and the dead. It happened during my second year at the cemetery. I was still relatively new, still figuring out how to shut off that part of your brain that wants to scream when the wind howls too long or when a shadow doesn't move like it should. It was a small cemetery, old, with a lot of unmarked graves and family plots going back to the 1800s. Some of the markers were so worn down you could barely read them. The kind of place where the trees lean in close and the mist never really clears out. That week we were preparing for a reburial. It doesn't happen often, but sometimes a family requests a body be moved to a different part of the cemetery, or even a different town. But this one was strange though. No living relatives had made the request. It was some kind of city paperwork error. A zoning thing, I think. All I knew was that my supervisor handed me a form, told me to be careful, and pointed me toward plot 143B. The headstone was cracked down the middle. Moss had grown along the base, and one corner had sunken slightly into the earth. I had to clear away the ivy just to read the name. Margaret Ellis, 1883 to 1912. That was it. Just a name and 2 dates worn smooth by time. I started digging late in the day, knowing it would run into the evening. That's not unusual. Grave digging isn't just about digging a hole. You have to be careful with older plots. The soil shifts over time. Sometimes the caskets collapse in on themselves. Sometimes the roots wrap around things they shouldn't. About 4 feet down, I hit the coffin. It was wooden, water damaged, and caved in slightly at the center. The nails had rusted into orange flakes, and the lid had warped from moisture. I crouched down with my flashlight and examined the box. Something about it made me uneasy. It wasn't fear exactly, just a heavy pressure, like I was being watched from behind, even though I was alone. I waited a moment, then reached for the coffin lid. It didn't take much to pry it loose. When it finally gave out, a gust of air rushed out. Not just a smell, but a temperature shift, like the inside had been colder than the soil around it. I froze. The flashlight flickered. Inside the coffin, the body was remarkably preserved. Her skin was pale and tight over the bones, like wax. The clothing was outdated, but still intact. A black dress, high collar, lace at the wrists. The strangest thing was her face. Calm, almost serene, with her eyes gently closed and lips barely parted. I've seen a lot of bodies in various states of decay. I've never seen anything like that. I covered her back up and radioed it in. The plan was to have the coffin lifted and moved the next morning. My job was done for the night, but I didn't leave. I couldn't. Something told me to stay and keep watch, so I sat by the grave with a thermos of lukewarm coffee and waited for morning. The fog rolled in thicker than usual, settling into the holes and creases of the cemetery like it had a mind of its own. The trees stopped moving. The bugs went silent. Even the birds stopped their night calls. At some point, maybe around 3 a.m., I heard it, a thump. Not like something falling onto the ground, more like something shifting from within. I stood up and walked to the edge of the open grave. The coffin was exactly where I'd left it, but the lid was slightly ajar. I had nailed it back down. I remember doing it. 3 long nails to hold it until morning. Now it was off-center, crooked. I climbed back into the hole, heart hammering, hands shaking. I lifted the lid just enough to peek inside. She was facing me. Her head had turned, slightly. Just enough that her face, once angled toward the heavens, now looked toward the edge of the coffin. Towards me. I stumbled back and fell against the wall of the grave, nearly dropping the flashlight. I forced myself to look again. Her eyes were still closed, her mouth still parted just a bit. But her neck, it wasn't where it had been before. I didn't call anyone. I didn't run. I just sat there, pressed against the dirt wall, waiting for the morning sun to break through the trees. When it finally did, I got up, resealed the coffin, and filled the grave halfway myself. I told the others the ground had shifted, and that's why the lid had moved. No one questioned it. Later that week, the coffin was moved. They dug it up again, loaded it onto a truck, and drove it out to another cemetery 2 counties over. I didn't go with them. I didn't want to know what they saw when they opened it again, if they opened it at all. But I did one thing before they took her away. I went back to the grave and removed the headstone. Carefully, quietly, I smashed it into pieces and buried the fragments deep beneath the soil, under a new tree we planted that spring. I didn't want anyone else digging there again. To this day, I never found out why her body was so well preserved. Never found any records of embalming. Never found a single living relative who could explain her story. All I know is what I saw, what I felt, and that night taught me something most people never have to learn. Some coffins are meant to stay closed. Some dead don't want to be moved. And some eyes, even when shut, are still watching. I'd been working the graveyard shift at the cemetery for nearly 8 years when it happened. By then I'd gotten used to the quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes your heartbeat sound loud. Most nights were uneventful, digging, repairing, cleaning, or marking new graves. But this night didn't just stick with me, it followed me. We had a section of the cemetery known as the family vaults, rows of old above-ground crypts built into the hillside. They were sealed in stone, some over a century old, with iron gates rusted shut from years of wind and rain. Nobody visited them anymore. No fresh flowers, no names spoken aloud. Just dust and time. That week, the crew was tasked with doing an inventory of the old vaults. Management wanted everything cataloged before some historical society visit. I didn't mind. I liked the solitude, and the air always felt cooler near the stone walls. On the third night of inspection, I was assigned Vault 37, one of the few still locked with an intact iron gate and a solid brass padlock. The record showed it hadn't been opened in over 50 years. I remember walking up the narrow path with my flashlight cutting through the dark. The gate creaked gently in the wind, and the vines crawling up its sides made it look like it had grown out of the ground itself. I shone my light through the bars, expecting to see the same thing I'd seen in every other crypt. Dusty urns, sealed coffins, crumbling plaques. But something was wrong. The inside wasn't dusty at all. The floor had been swept recently. The glass on the inner coffin had no cobwebs. And at the far end of the crypt, something reflected my flashlight. A silver bowl. Shiny, like it had been polished that day. I stood there for a full minute, unsure if I was imagining things. Then I stepped closer and saw it. Footprints. Small, bare footprints in the layer of dirt just outside the crypt, leading in and out. I wasn't the only one who'd been here. But who would break into an old crypt and leave it cleaner than before? The padlock was untouched. Still sealed. No marks, no scratches. The gate wasn't forced open. It hadn't been opened at all. I marked the vault as incomplete inspection and decided to return with the supervisor the next night. But I didn't sleep. Something about it wouldn't leave me alone. All night, my mind kept returning to those footprints and the bowl. At one point, I convinced myself it was just a prank or maybe an animal, but that didn't explain the cleanliness. That didn't explain the smell. Yes, there was a smell. Not rot or mildew like most old crypts. No, this one smelled faintly of roses. Fresh ones. The next night I brought bolt cutters, figuring we'd get the lock off and clear up the mystery. But when I arrived at Vault 37, the lock was gone. Not broken, not lying on the ground. Just gone. The gate was slightly ajar, swinging gently like it had just been pushed. I called out, even though I knew no one would answer. Then I stepped inside. It was colder inside the vault than the air outside. Not cool like stone usually is. Freezing, like the kind of cold that seeps into your bones. The inner coffin was glass-topped, something you rarely see anymore. And through that glass, I could see the preserved body of a young girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old. Blonde hair, hands folded neatly over a small bouquet of roses. They were fresh, still vibrant, still fragrant, still wet with dew. I don't know how long I stood there staring. My eyes wouldn't blink. My body wouldn't move. I could hear my heartbeat thumping like a drum. Then I looked at the walls and noticed something carved there. Hundreds of tally marks. Hundreds of scratches. As if someone had spent years counting every day. Then came the whisper. Not loud, not sudden, just a faint brushing sound, like someone breathing against the back of my neck. I spun around. Nothing. I backed out of the vault and shut the gate behind me, but I didn't lock it. I couldn't. I needed to get out of there. I told the supervisor what I'd seen, but when we returned the next morning, the roses were gone. The floor was dusty, Again. The coffin glass was fogged with age, and the silver bowl I had seen, nowhere in sight. They told me I was tired, that I was probably sleep-deprived or imagining things. Vault 37 was marked as sealed and not structurally safe, probably to keep anyone from poking around again. But I know what I saw. Weeks later, I went back alone. During the day, just to be sure. The padlock was back in place. Same rusted one. Same cracks and corrosion. But hanging beside it, tied delicately with a red ribbon, was a single rose. No name. No note. Just the flower. I left the cemetery a year later. But sometimes I dream of that crypt. In the dream, I'm back inside. Standing in front of the girl's coffin. Staring down at her peaceful face. But in the dream, her eyes are open, watching me, waiting. I had been digging graves for 15 years when it happened. By then I thought I'd seen everything. Drunken mourners, grieving mothers collapsing at the edge of the hole. Even a fight once between two brothers over who should throw the first handful of dirt. But nothing prepared me for what I found that summer evening. The cemetery where I worked was old. Not historic or scenic, just old. Half the markers were unreadable. Stones leaned like tired men and weeds pushed through every crack. Most of the families who had people buried there stopped coming decades ago. The graves still got dug, but there was no real sense of life around the place. It was quiet. Always quiet. That evening, I was sent to prepare a site near the far end of the cemetery. Section D, close to the woods. Nobody liked working in that part. The ground was softer, often uneven. Sometimes it flooded. I brought extra boards for reinforcement and my usual tools. The sun was going down as I arrived, but I had a flashlight and figured I could finish quickly. The record showed it was a new burial, nothing special. But when I got there, the plot didn't look empty. At first I thought it was a mistake in the paperwork. That happens sometimes. Maybe the area had been used years ago and never logged properly. The grass looked normal, a little overgrown, but no mound, no flowers, no sign anyone had visited in years. Still, something about the ground was wrong, uneven, like someone had disturbed it not long ago. I started digging anyway. The soil came up easier than I expected. Damp, dark, and fresh. That should have been a red flag. The surface was overgrown, but a foot beneath, it was like someone had already broken the earth not long ago. I kept going. Maybe someone buried a pet. Maybe someone used the graveyard for something unofficial. It wasn't unheard of. I once found an urn with no label, just a faded ribbon. People get desperate. About 4 feet down, my shovel hit something soft. That's not a normal depth for a coffin. It should have been deeper. And this wasn't wood or metal. It gave way like fabric stretched over a frame. I knelt down and brushed at the dirt with my gloves, slower now. My flashlight flickered across something pale. It was a plastic sheet. Thick, industrial, like something you'd find at a construction site. It was wrapped tight around something large, bulky. I stood up and hesitated. I didn't want to know what was inside. Every instinct told me to stop, but I kept going. I cleared off more of the dirt, careful not to damage whatever was underneath. The plastic was tied with rope at one end, knotted so tight, it looked like someone really didn't want it opened. I shined my light closer, and my stomach dropped. Through a thin part of the plastic, I saw what looked like hair. Long, dark, matted, and next to it, a hand. It wasn't skeletal. It was recent. Human. I dropped my flashlight. For a full minute, I just stood there, staring into that hole. The smell hit next. Earthy at first, then sour, metallic. You don't forget that smell. It clings to your clothes, your hands, your memory. I didn't touch it again. I climbed out of the grave, left my tools behind, and called the police. They arrived fast, faster than I expected. They blocked off the area and asked a dozen questions. I gave them everything I knew, which wasn't much. I was just doing my job. They seemed more irritated than surprised, like they'd been expecting something like this. Later, I found out this wasn't the first time. That part of the cemetery had long been a dumping ground. Literally. Years back, someone had been using unregistered plots to hide bodies. Nobody ever came to that section. The perfect place to bury secrets. They never told me who she was. The body I found, no age, no name, not even a guess. Just another missing person added to a growing list. Maybe she was someone's sister, daughter, friend, or maybe she was forgotten, thrown away like trash. Either way, I found her too late. I didn't go back to that corner of the cemetery for weeks. Someone else handled the burial in her place. I asked to be reassigned to the older sections, the ones with real markers, the ones where people still left flowers, but I never stopped thinking about her. Sometimes when I walked by Section D, I could feel it again. That heaviness in the ground. The wrongness. Like the earth itself was trying to tell me something. I kept digging graves after that. It's what I know. But I don't do it the same way anymore. I double check every plot. I listen to my gut when something feels off. And I always treat the ground like it might be hiding something. Because sometimes it is. Not every ghost wears chains or floats above your bed. Some lie quietly, just beneath the surface, waiting for someone to notice they were ever there at all. And sometimes that someone is me.